Thank you. Let me just ask, to go back to this point that you made about lack of accountability, Angel, how much of a problem do you see that as political issues that get in the way of closing this gap? Well, I mean, is the District of Columbia unique?
Right, well, I mean, I think Michelle just, said it perfectly when she said, look, we're looking for a silver bullet, and what happens is people actually believe that we're going to solve the problem within the next 5 years. Like, I hear that to me, and it sounds, it's like telling me you're going to get to California in 10 minutes. I don't know how you're going to do that. That's how it sounds to me. And so I think that what happens is there's the pressure of trying to find a solution, and people feel that political pressure to try to look for that silver bullet.
But Diane, isn't the legislation that's now pending in Congress promising a silver bullet?
We have an achievement gap on this panel. I don't know how to turn the microphone on. What we have as the law of the land today is the Bush-era No Child Left Behind law, which says that 100% of children will be proficient in math and in reading by the year 2014, and schools that are not on track to meet that goal will face severe consequences, like firing the principal, firing the staff, closing the school, turning the school over to private management. And Secretary Duncan said just recently that 82% of the schools will be failing schools this year. This is the most ridiculous piece of legislation ever passed by Congress. The silver bullet idea is if you just test and test, and we are now, as a nation, investing billions in testing. If we took all the billions that went into testing and put it into early childhood education, we would make a big change.
But if you don't test, how do you measure progress, and how do you assess the teachers and the staff of schools?
First of all, you need testing for information, but we're using testing now as punishments. And that's why we're seeing so many cheating scandals in Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania and Atlanta, because people are being told if you don't meet an impossible goal, you're going to be humiliated, and then you're going to be fired and your school will be closed. And when people are under the gun, some people do terrible things. So, yeah, we should use tests diagnostically. We should use them to help children. We should use them to help teachers improve their instruction. But there is just a huge body of research that says that when you tie incentives to test scores, the tests themselves become invalid because you then start teaching kids how to take the test. And then they learn test-taking skills, and when they get into a community college, they don't even know how to read, write, or do mathematics. All they know how to do is take tests about reading, writing, and mathematics.
Angel, you wanted to intervene?
Yeah, I think this is the use of testing and all the solutions that we come up with or we propose. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there's this core model that we have for education. And for some reason, we work around this core, so we make incremental changes. Let's tweak this, now let's do this, now let's do this. And in doing that, we wonder why we're spinning our wheels and nothing's happening, we're not getting traction, and no solution is working. We're pouring tons of money into it, and part of it is that we're working with this model that, again, I think is incompatible with how people who are disadvantaged see the world. What we need is a new model. I don't know what that looks like, right? But we need a new model. But we need a new model. So in other words, you're not going to change the game of basketball by raising the goal by 1 inch. You're not going to change the game of football by adding 1 yard to the field, right? We need 6 goals in the game of basketball. We need 8 bases in baseball. That looks completely different, and that's what we need. We need a whole new model of education that takes into account the fact that, there's the model we have now is not resonating with the vision that our kids are basically squinting to see what the model suggests they should be seeing.
But Jim Comer, the administration wants to change aspects of the No Child Left Behind legislation including changing the name. Is that promising?
No.
Why not?
I think Angel had it. We're entrenched in a mechanical model that grew out of the industrial age of how children learn and how teachers should teach. It's wrong, and it has damaged more people than anything else I can imagine.
But why is it so much more damaging to, I mean, we hear all the time, we hear the debate. There's a crisis in education. But I just read a piece of paper in the New Yorker that says there is no crisis in education. Well, so why is it that if everything that you all are saying is true, it's the black kids who are suffering the most?
Because the black community, is most vulnerable and has been most vulnerable. But it's not only black kids, poor white kids, Southeast Asian kids, some, and Hispanic kids are all suffering because the nature of their economic, social, political experience has been such that they are growing up in vulnerable families that can't prepare them for school. And you need a model that recognizes that the kids come to school underdeveloped. And that every teacher, the most efficient and effective way to improve American education is to help every teacher and every administrator understand how to create a culture in school that supports the development of kids so that they can learn. Because it's development, when children are developing well, they can learn. And so you can't try to teach ignore at the same time ignore development.
Michelle?
So I want to address this issue that Dr. Ravitch was talking about, sort of, testing and it being punitive, et cetera. I think that there is a misperception around this that I'm very worried about. I think we have to look at it from the perspective, if we're going to look at testing data, and use that data then to determine what we should be doing better and making sure that we're not being punitive. I would ask you this. What would you do if you saw data that came back that said that a teacher, year in and year out for the last 5 years, for the children in her class, not only didn't improve their learning and their academic progress, but the kids in her class every year for the last 5 years has gone backwards. They've lost ground. Do you keep that person in the classroom or not? See, when I was the chancellor in Washington, D.C., I put my own 2 kids in the D.C. public schools. That raised the stakes, because that meant that every decision that I was making every day was going to impact my 2 girls. So if I was going to make the decision that, this teacher, if we see that they are ineffective, we're going to give them another year or 2 to see if they can get better. If I was going to make that decision, then I would have to be willing to have my kid taught by that person.
And so what do you do with that teacher? I mean, how do you make that teacher get better?
So this is my point, is that if I'm looking at it from the perspective of, would I allow my children to go into that person's classroom? The answer would be absolutely not. And nobody in this room would let their child or their grandchild go into that person's classroom either. So I don't see it as a thing where, this is punitive, et cetera, because if we are not putting in place accountability, then there's still punishments. The children are the ones that are being punished for the lack of our moving in the right direction and using that data to make the decisions that we think are going to benefit them in the long run.
Diane?
Well, first of all, if you have experienced principals who are themselves master teachers, they would never let that teacher stay in the classroom. And in fact, the teaching profession is different from any other profession that I'm aware of, and that is that 50% of the people who start teaching are gone within 5 years. A lot of them have been fired. And to say that, you know, Michelle didn't say this, but people will say teachers get tenure, they never get fired. Teachers get fired all the time, and they can get fired for all kinds of reasons. But the principal has to visit that classroom, make a judgment, look at the test scores. What I find obnoxious is when a newspaper like the Los Angeles Times makes up its own scheme and prints a list of teachers in the newspaper and online and say, we're naming the names, here are the test scores. And yet there are testing experts across the country who will say, that's wrong. In what profession do you put personnel evaluations on the web for everyone to see? It's ridiculous.
Actually, teachers don't get fired all the time. Less than 1% of the teachers in this country get fired. In fact, it is incredibly difficult to fire a teacher. There is data that shows this definitively. In some case, I mean, in New York City, they showed that on average it takes 3 to 4 years and $250,000 to remove an ineffective teacher from the classroom.
It is very easy to get caught up in the hiring and firing and the accountability and so on, and ignore the preparation of teachers. You know, it's not fair to the teacher who wasn't prepared to teach to then blame him or her for not being able to teach. Most of our money and most of our energy and most of our time goes into the issue of accountability. But you know, I'm a physician, and I know that the thermometer does not tell you much other than that there's something wrong. That's all a test score tells you. It is the whole process of preparing teachers and managing and organizing schools and the model that we're operating from that is wrong. And if we get caught up and get to fighting over this and this piece and that piece and the other of education and miss that critical dynamic, the preparation of teachers, the preparation of kids, then we'll never change it. We'll be another 50 years and we'll still won't have it.
But you have an enormous number of teachers who are already in the system and are not being and as you say, and as everyone here has said, many of whom are not prepared. So maybe you can change the paradigm prior, but what do you do with all of those who are in the classroom today?
There's something called selection, induction, and continuing support that needs to be present in all schools, but it also needs to be focused around a new model, and that is on providing that. We went into Detroit, which is the toughest union town in the country, and got the union head involved in thinking about these issues. We went into a room where people were hopeless. 3 years later, they were excited, they were sky high, because they carried out a process where they learned about kids. They learned about involving parents on the job, and that could be done. And that's what I think needs to be done, has to be done.
See, I think this is the problem we get into, is that someone has to take the hit. Someone has to be the fall guy, right? So it's teachers, it's families, it's parents, but someone's got to take the blame for this. Someone's going down. As opposed to saying, well, you know, we're going to continue trying to point a finger at something because we're nibbling around the edges. One of the things I don't like about the blame game is that it can lead to narratives of cultural deficiency, right? So, for example, when people say it's parents, it's families, what they're really saying is that it's black parents and it's black families. And so what I don't like about that narrative is, one, I just don't like it just for ideological reasons, but two, it's not rooted in empiricism. We have to remember, so before I follow through, we have to remember, let's not make the outlier the norm. Okay, so there are some black people who grew up in South Central LA and they made it out. That's not the norm. That's the exception, right? And so that person can say, oh, I made it, everyone can make it. Wait a minute, there's a distribution here. Let's not forget that. So now, when people say about parents and parental involvement, parenting is important, okay? Parenting is important. What I'm gonna say is that parental involvement, empirically, I find is not linked to achievement. Let me backtrack, okay? Let me backtrack. We like to think that we're important, right? We like to, from an emotional standpoint, we want to believe that, right? But I'm an empiricist, and so I go based on what the data tell me. What I find is that what we do is we do something called statistically controlled. So for example, if in this room there was a gender gap and say males perform better than females on some task, and we said, well, it's because most of the males are sitting toward the front. Let's control for seating arrangement. Now, if we randomize and retest, and the gap goes from 20 points to 10, then we've accounted for 50% of it. We've controlled for seating arrangement. That is, we've compared males and females who are similarly situated from the front with regard to seating. That's control. Okay, when you control for parental involvement characteristics, and I control for 61 of them, in other words, talking to the teacher, talking to the principal, reading to the child, choosing the child's classes, helping the child read, helping the child with homework, 61 of these, I found that reduced the black-white gap by 7%. Okay? Now, see, people will see the connection between an affluent parent or black kid is doing well, and they'll say, oh, look, this parent is really involved, therefore it's because the child is doing well because of the parental involvement. And here's how I explain that. If you walk through someone's home in South Central LA, in the worst neighborhood you can find, and you just walk through the home for 10 seconds, then you come out. Now we walk through Charlene's house for 10 seconds, or Henry Louis Gates' house for 10 seconds, and then you come out. They don't even have to say a word to their children. You're gonna realize which child is gonna learn more. Yeah. It's not anything they're doing. They don't even have to parent. It's just the space that they've created. It's in the air. They're breathing different air. It's the home office. It's when you get in the car, you turn the car on, NPR happens to be playing. It's the verbal jousting. Your colleague says something, and then you say, well, wait a minute, I don't know if that's the case. Your child is in the other room listening to that verbal jousting and picking up those skills, and so they're essentially living the lives that they would live whether they had children or not. But you know what? They're going to get credit for saying, oh, you guys are so involved. Your kids are doing well academically. It's because they have. And then there are some parents who don't have. You see what I'm saying? And so it's really a resource thing. That's why Dr. Comer mentioned the people who are doing poorly academically are blacks, Latinos, Southeast Asians. Who are these people? People who don't have resources. When I controlled for parents' education and income, I found that accounted for 25% of the gap. Those two factors accounted for more of the gap than 61 measures of parental involvement.
Okay, so we have a situation in this country now where so many people are out of work. We have a depressed economy. We don't see any end to this. So we've drilled down to a certain extent into the problem, as you academics say. You drill down into things, right? What do you do about it? There are no jobs out there. And so the parents don't have jobs. So they can't have, you made certain presumptions about my house, which may or may not be the case. But let's say, for the sake of this discussion, you were right. Okay. What do you do?
Well, that's the thing, is that I respect the problem too much to say that I have a solution in my brain. It's complicated, and we need people who know a lot more about education and teaching and kids. I'm not in the classroom. I don't know about kids that way. We need people who really, really understand this to come up with a solution. Having said that, you know, I think that the solution, and I think I've alluded to this earlier, is we need a whole new model. I don't know what that looks like, right? But we need a whole new model. Clearly, the one that we have now is not doing it, and that's the problem. Is that we can do like the Harlem Children's Zone, and we can just give people a bunch of resources. Is that sustainable economically on a wide scale? I don't know.
Well, let me ask Diane, because if poverty is the problem, how do you fix that?
Okay, the truth is that our society is going in the wrong direction. And we should do what works. And I'll tell you what works based on research. First of all, we should be making sure that every woman who becomes pregnant in this nation has adequate medical and nutritional care. Women who have children who don't have that are likely to have low birth weight babies, and 1/3 of those children will probably have learning disabilities, and they were at greater risk for autism. That's just a fact. So we could stop a big chunk of the achievement gap just by making sure that babies are born healthy. That's a good start. And when I think of all the billions spent on testing, we could have solved that problem by now just in the last 10 years. We should have, again, research-based early childhood education. We know that it works, and we're not investing enough in early childhood education. I know that the president plans to. And by early childhood education, I'm not talking about just cognitive skills, but the kind of non-cognitive skills that are also necessary that Dr. Comer emphasizes. We have a Nobel Prize winning recipient, James Heckman, who has demonstrated early childhood education works. It's important for child development. We also know from Project STAR in Tennessee, class size reduction works, especially for black children. For some reason, black children are more responsive to small class sizes, and yet they are, in most of our inner cities, in increasingly large classes as budgets are being cut. We know that desegregation had a huge impact on the black-white achievement gap in the 70s and 80s. It was one of the factors that was identified in the various studies of the reduction and why that worked, desegregation. And one of the most successful places in this country, Wake County, North Carolina, where they had a desegregation plan that the community was very proud of, and some very wealthy out-of-state people came in and ran school board candidates saying, we don't want busing, and they just elected a school board that is going to take away their very successful program that has reduced the achievement gap very substantially. And there was a book written about it called Why Are There No Bad Schools in Wake County? That book's going to have to be rewritten. There'll have to be another chapter about why did the bad schools come back. Basic nutrition, basic health care, many children lack that. Every school, what's happened in the era of No Child Left Behind testing is that many schools have dropped the arts. Many schools have dropped physical education. Many schools have dropped the things that bring children to school joyfully. You cannot have good education without having things that kids actually want to do in school. No one wants to come to school to be tested. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have tests. I'm just saying we should have a lot fewer tests. And it's also very important that our schools have the resources they need. Some of our suburban schools have twice as much resources as the inner city schools, and that's not right.
But isn't that a matter of politics?
It is a matter of politics. We have, in the last election, we elected 18 governors who are cutting the education budget, who are increasing class size, who are privatizing schools, and who are actually imposing vouchers, which have a terrible track record. The children in Milwaukee have had vouchers now for 21 years, and their test scores are about the same as the kids as black kids in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Georgia after 21 years. So we have a lot of states that are heading in the wrong direction, and it's a matter of politics. It's not going to change until people demand a change.
You've had a very successful model for so many years. Why isn't it catching on in more places and having more successes and not having a reason to have this panel?
Truth is, I don't know the answer to that question. On the other hand, I think it is primarily because, I don't disagree with anything that's been said here. But I do think most people don't understand. Most people take credit for their own achievement as has something to do with their brain and their willingness to work and so on. And so we underemphasize this whole business of the quality of the interaction between the child and not only the authority figures, but as mentioned, the environment that they're in. And that we have to systematically create such environments and create people in those environments that can interact with children in a way that promote the development across the board. Now, I don't believe that the school alone can do this job. I believe that the communities that have been most adversely affected are going to have to mobilize in a way that they send a message to kids that's very different from the one that they're hearing right now. It's going back to what Skip Gates talked about, what we believed was so important in right out of slavery and in the 40s and the 50s and so on. That message has to be sent from a community that is respected by young people. And we're not organized to do that. We're not even organizing to do that. And I believe that in addition to the schools changing and focusing on support for development, the community itself has to focus on support for development. And I think with that combination, we can give children the kind of environment they need to develop well and learn well.
And you've been successful at it. In how many schools?
We've been in over 1,000 schools in the 40 years. I'd say that 2/3 have made progress, 1/3 have made dramatic progress. Right now, we can equal, many of the schools equal the state in achievement levels. And they have social, psychological, emotional development that gives them a chance to be successful in life, because we don't focus on the test scores alone. It's preparation for life that we focus on, and in the process, the children do well in school.